The winter wind cut different across the Dakota Territory prairie. Johann Bauer learned that his first February in 1874, when ice formed on his cabin floor 3 feet from the iron stove, and his wash water froze solid by morning. He had built his homestead cabin exactly the way every settler in the territory was told to build it. Light frame on shallow stone piers, with an open crawl space underneath. Separate root cellar dug 50 feet away, proven and trusted. By spring he had burned through 6 full cords of prairie hay and scarce timber, yet still woke to frost on his floorboards. Across the grasslands, homesteaders were losing the same battle in houses built by the book and failing by the season. Over the next 3 winters, Johann quietly adapted techniques from his German village and plains earth lodges to create a cabin that stayed warmer, used less fuel, and never saw frost on the floors. What did he understand about coupling a house to the earth that every modern basement builder has forgotten? The treeless expanse of Dakota Territory stretched beyond every horizon in 1873, when the Homestead Act pulled families westward, with promises of free land and fresh starts. Most newcomers arrived clutching pamphlets printed in Chicago and Minneapolis, filled with cheerful diagrams of claim shanties and frame cabins that looked sturdy enough on paper. The reality hit different when November winds drove powder snow through every gap and keyhole, and families discovered that methods borrowed from Illinois and Wisconsin fell apart under prairie conditions. The accepted wisdom came straight from government bulletins and lumber company brochures. Build light and build fast. Balloon frame walls on shallow stone piers or wooden skids, with plenty of open air flowing beneath the floorboards to keep the timbers dry. Dig your root cellar 50 to 100 feet from the house, either as a separate pit covered with planks and sod or a small mounded structure that kept food storage away from living quarters. The underlying theory made sense to Eastern-trained carpenters and county agents. Dry air circulation prevented rot in the wooden frame. A detached cellar avoided dampness and odors in the main house. A large iron stove could overpower any cold that seeped up through the floorboards. The Hendricks family, settled on a quarter section 3 miles north of Johann's future claim, followed every rule to the letter. Their cabin sat on fieldstone piers 18 inches off the ground, with inch-thick pine planks spanning the joists and gaps between boards wide enough to slip a knife blade through. The crawl space underneath stayed open to the wind on all sides, just as the pattern books recommended. Their root cellar, a rectangular pit 4 feet deep and 6 feet square, sat a stone's throw from the kitchen door, lined with loose fieldstone and covered with split logs and prairie sod. That first winter broke them methodically. Wind-driven snow packed the crawl space solid, turning the underneath of their house into a snow cave that never melted until April. Frost formed on the upper surface of their floorboards by December, thick enough to scrape with a spoon. The children slept on straw pallets raised on wooden trunks to escape the cold that radiated up through the planks. But young Samuel still suffered blackened toes despite wool socks and a stove that glowed cherry red through most nights. The family burned through 6.5 cords of precious cottonwood and willow, hauled at great cost from creek bottoms 20 miles away. Yet their main room rarely climbed above the mid-30s in degrees Fahrenheit during cold snaps. The root cellar fared even worse. By January, the shallow pit had frozen halfway to the bottom, splitting their stored carrots and turning potatoes to mush. When the spring thaw came, meltwater turned the cellar into a frigid soup that spoiled most of their remaining vegetables before planting time. The Hendricks family sold their claim that summer and retreated to relatives in Minnesota, defeated by methods that were supposed to work. Johann Bauer watched their struggle from his rented cabin 2 miles south, where he endured the same bone-deep cold but filed away every failure for future reference. At 34 years old, he had grown up in a German-Russian farming village along the Volga, where his family's brick farmhouse sat over a barrel-vaulted masonry cellar that stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter. His father and uncles were stoneworkers who had spent generations picking rock from fields and laying foundations that lasted, passing down rules about drainage, depth, and thermal mass that came from centuries of cold weather building. On his journey west, Johann had paused at older settlements near the Missouri River, where he observed the remains of Mandan and Hidatsa earth lodges. These partially sunken houses, with their thick earthen walls and carefully sized smoke holes, had sheltered families through prairie winters far harsher than anything European immigrants had faced. A Lakota carpenter working on repairs to a trading post storehouse had explained in broken English how earth lodges stayed livable when surface air swung from blazing heat to bitter cold, because the ground underneath held steady temperatures year-round. Johann's education continued through direct observation. During a brief January thaw, he lowered himself into a neighbor's stock well to retrieve a frozen bucket and noticed that the air 30 feet down felt noticeably warmer than the cutting wind at ground level. On a visit to a German-Russian farmstead in the next county, he found a small stone house with a cellar directly beneath the kitchen and observed that their wooden floors felt warm to bare feet, even when outside temperatures dropped below zero. These experiences crystallized into rough principles. The earth below the frost line held more trustworthy temperatures than the sky above. Stone and soil made better thermal partners than wind and open air. Food storage, floor warmth, and structural stability could all be served by the same deep excavation if properly planned and executed. Johann began to envision a cabin where the living space drew warmth from stable ground temperatures instead of fighting the atmosphere with nothing but burning wood. His neighbors thought differently. At township meetings, established homesteaders warned that digging deep cellars under light frame buildings was asking for cave-ins and structural failure. Elias Turner, a carpenter who had built most of the claim shanties in the area, insisted that Johann's ideas would trap moisture and rot the floor joists within 2 seasons. The county land agent, fresh from Agricultural College in Iowa, cited official bulletins that recommended keeping houses elevated and cellars separate as modern scientific practice. When Johann began marking out a deep excavation on his new claim in the spring of 1874, several neighbors made quiet bets that he would be rebuilding on conventional piers before his first winter ended. They had seen too many greenhorn experiments fail to believe that book learning from the old country could improve on American frontier methods. Johann's initial plan remained rough and incomplete. He envisioned a deep stone-lined root cellar directly beneath his cabin, connected to the living space by a steep stair and covered with thick planks instead of open crawl space. He assumed that his iron stove and chimney would handle any moisture issues, and that a single small vent would provide adequate air circulation. The finer points of vapor control, seasonal adjustments, and integrated envelope design lay in the future, lessons that would emerge from harsh experience and careful observation of what worked and what failed. The conflict had been drawn. Conventional frontier wisdom demanded separation between house and earth, trusting elevation and ventilation to solve the problems of cold and damp. Johann believed that coupling his cabin directly to the stable temperatures below ground would create a warmer, more efficient, and more resilient home. The coming winters would test which approach deserved to survive. Johann broke ground on his claim in late April of 1874, when the prairie soil had thawed enough to dig, but before spring planting demanded his full attention. The excavation for his under-cabin cellar required precise planning that went beyond simple hole digging. He laid out the cabin footprint first, marking a modest structure 16 feet wide by 20 feet long, then centered a 12-foot by 12-foot square within that rectangle for the cellar excavation. This arrangement would place the deepest storage directly beneath the main living area, while leaving room for foundation walls around the perimeter. The digging proved more demanding than Johann had anticipated. Prairie soil started as black loam for the first 18 inches, then shifted to dense clay mixed with gravel and scattered field stone. At 4 feet down, he encountered a layer of blue clay so compact it required pickaxe work to break through. By 6 feet, the excavation walls began showing seepage from spring meltwater, forcing Johann to dig drainage channels that angled away from the cellar toward a low swale 50 yards to the east. Johann's depth decision came from specific temperature knowledge gleaned from well diggers in the territory. A Swedish immigrant who had dug stock wells across 3 counties told him that ground temperatures stopped following surface weather at about 8 feet down, and by 10 feet, the earth held steady near the region's average annual air temperature. In Dakota Territory, that meant the deep soil stayed near 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of whether surface air blazed at 90 degrees in July or plunged to 20 below zero in January. At 10 feet below the planned cabin floor level, Johann reached the target depth and began the foundation work that would separate his system from conventional building. Instead of scattered stone piers supporting individual floor joists, he built a continuous field stone ledge around the entire cellar perimeter. This ledge, roughly 18 inches thick and rising 6 feet from the cellar floor, would distribute the cabin's weight evenly while creating a thermal bridge between the stable earth temperature and the living space above. The stonework required techniques Johann had learned from his father's generation in the Volga region. He selected flat field stones for the faces and filled the interior with smaller rocks and clay mortar, creating walls that would shed water while maintaining structural integrity. The foundation stones extended 18 inches below the cellar floor level, reaching down into undisturbed soil that would resist frost heave and seasonal movement. Above the stone ledge, Johann built up with sod and timber cribbing to reach the underside of the floor joists, creating a continuous bearing surface instead of isolated support points. Access to the cellar came through a straight stairway descending from the northeast corner of the cabin, where the kitchen area would be located. Johann framed the stairwell with heavy timbers and lined it with plank siding, creating a vertical shaft that would allow controlled air movement between the cellar and living space. The stair opening measured 3 feet by 6 feet, large enough for carrying stored goods, but small enough to fit a tight ceiling door that could regulate thermal exchange. The floor system above the cellar departed radically from standard prairie construction. Johann placed his joists directly on the continuous stone ledge, eliminating the open crawl space entirely. The joists themselves were heavier than typical frame construction, hewn from cottonwood logs 8 inches by 10 inches in cross-section, spaced 16 inches center to center. This massive floor frame could support the weight of family, furniture, and stored goods without sagging, while providing thermal mass that would moderate temperature swings. Johann's first winter over the deep cellar provided immediate confirmation that earth coupling changed the fundamental energy balance of frontier housing. During a December cold snap that drove outside temperatures to 15 degrees below zero Fahrenheit for 5 consecutive nights, he monitored conditions throughout his cabin cellar system using a simple mercury thermometer borrowed from the territorial surveyor. The cellar air temperature held steady at 42 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the cold spell, warmed by contact with the surrounding stone walls and earth floor. The main cabin floor, built directly over this moderated airspace, maintained surface temperatures in the low 40s, even when the iron stove burned down to coals overnight. Johann could walk barefoot on his floorboards at dawn, while his neighbors' cabins showed frost patterns on their single-layer floors above open crawl spaces. Wood consumption measurements revealed the system's efficiency gains. Johann burned approximately 4 cords of mixed cottonwood and willow through his first winter, compared to the 6 cords his neighbors required in similar-sized cabins. The deep earth thermal mass stored heat when the stove ran hot during evening cooking, and released that stored warmth gradually through the night and early morning hours. This thermal flywheel effect reduced the sharp temperature swings that forced other homesteaders to maintain high burn rates around the clock. The cellar's food storage performance exceeded Johann's expectations from his European experience. Root vegetables stored on wooden shelves along the stone walls maintained ideal conditions throughout the winter. Potatoes stayed firm and showed no sprouting even in March, while carrots and parsnips retained their crisp texture. Cabbage heads, wrapped in clean straw and placed on the earthen floor, developed only surface wilting that could be trimmed away to reveal sound hearts underneath. Structural stability proved another advantage of the continuous foundation system. While neighboring cabins on shallow piers showed settling and cracking from frost heave cycles, Johann's house remained level and tight. The deep foundation extended below the frost line, anchoring the structure in stable soil that resisted seasonal movement. The stone ledge distributed loads evenly, preventing the concentrated stress points that cause pier foundations to shift and tilt. Other homesteaders in the township began observing Johann's results with growing interest. The Olson family, struggling through their second winter in a conventional frame cabin, visited during a January thaw and noted the dramatic difference in floor temperature and overall comfort. Lars Olsen, a practical Norwegian farmer, spent an afternoon examining the cellar construction and asking detailed questions about excavation depth, stone selection, and drainage management. Johann's approach represented one solution within a broader range of earth-coupled building systems emerging across the northern plains. Some German-Russian families built full dugouts, with living quarters entirely below grade on hillsides. Others constructed partial earth shelters, with bermed walls on 3 sides and conventional framing on the 4th. Scandinavian immigrants adapted their log building traditions by banking earth against lower courses and adding thick sod roofs for additional thermal mass. The success of Johann's deep cellar foundation established the thermal and structural base for refinements that would follow in subsequent seasons. The stable earth coupling and continuous foundation had solved the fundamental problems of cold floors and excessive fuel consumption, but new challenges emerged around moisture control, air circulation, and seasonal comfort optimization that would demand additional innovations. Johann's second winter over the deep cellar revealed weaknesses that his first successful season had masked. The fundamental thermal coupling worked as designed, but new problems emerged as the family settled into daily routines. Cold drafts leaked between the floorboards, sending streams of cellar air across their ankles whenever they sat near the table. The cabin's outer walls, where the short stone foundation met the wooden frame above ground level, created a thermal bridge that bled warmth to the winter wind. Most troubling, the interior air stratified sharply, with temperatures near the ceiling climbing toward uncomfortable levels while the floor edges remained distinctly cool. The single-layer plank floor, built from inch-thick pine boards with typical frontier gaps, allowed too much air exchange between the cellar and living space. When Johann sat reading by lamplight in the evening, he could feel cool currents rising through the floorboard joints and pooling around his feet. His wife Maria complained that her spinning wheel, positioned near the outer wall, stayed uncomfortably cold despite the iron stove glowing red just 8 feet away. The children instinctively avoided the floor areas closest to the exterior walls, clustering instead near the stove and the central trapdoor to the cellar. Johann found solutions by observing successful earth-sheltered structures throughout the territory. A visit to the Muller family's sod house, built entirely from prairie blocks cut with sharp spades, demonstrated how thick earthen walls maintained steady interior conditions. Heinrich Müller explained that his sod walls, 3 feet thick at the base and carefully laid with grass side down, stayed warm to the touch even during blizzards because the earth mass absorbed and released heat gradually rather than conducting it rapidly to the outside air. The Norwegian neighbor Erik Haugen provided crucial guidance about perimeter protection during a February visit to examine Johann's cellar system. Haugen had grown up in timber country, where log houses were routinely banked with earth each autumn, then scraped clean each spring to dry the logs. He described the technique of building earthen skirts around buildings, emphasizing that proper drainage and sloped profiles prevented moisture problems while dramatically reducing heat loss through foundation areas. Johann implemented the sod skirt during the spring of 1875, after the ground thawed enough for digging and sod cutting. He excavated a trench 18 inches deep around the cabin's perimeter, then built up a berm using prairie sod blocks cut from unused portions of his claim. The finished skirt rose 3 feet above ground level and extended 4 feet out from the cabin walls at the base, creating a gentle slope that shed rainwater while insulating the vulnerable junction between stone foundation and wooden frame. The sod construction required specific techniques to ensure structural integrity and drainage. Johann laid each course of blocks grass side down, creating interlocking joints that resisted settling and erosion. He incorporated a drainage layer of coarse gravel at the bottom of the berm, connected to shallow ditches that carried water away from the cabin toward natural low areas. The outer face of the berm received a protective coating of clay-rich subsoil, packed smooth and sloped at a 30-degree angle to shed rain and snow melt effectively. Inside the cabin, Johann addressed the drafty floor problem by installing a second layer over the existing planks, The double floor system started with the original pine boards as a rough subfloor, then added a 2-inch layer of packed sand and fine clay excavated from his cellar digging. This fill layer was thickest near the outer walls, where it provided maximum insulation from drafts, and tapered thinner toward the center to maintain some thermal connection to the cellar below. Over the packed fill, Johann laid tight-fitting tongue and groove boards of local oak, creating a smooth, draft-free walking surface. The double-floor construction eliminated the ankle-level drafts while preserving controlled thermal exchange with the cellar. The packed sand and clay layer blocked air movement without creating an impermeable barrier, allowing slow heat conduction between the cellar's stable temperature and the living space above. The finished floor felt substantially warmer underfoot, particularly near the outer walls where the insulating fill was deepest. Johann also reorganized the cabin's interior layout to maximize the benefits of earth coupling. He positioned the main table, chairs, and evening work areas in the half of the room directly above the cellar, where thermal conditions remained most stable. The iron stove stayed in its central location, but Johann arranged seating and workspaces to take advantage of the moderated temperatures rising from below. Storage areas, seasonal clothing, and less frequently used items were relegated to the zones farthest from the cellar. The improved envelope system faced its first major test during a March windstorm that brought sustained winds of 40 miles per hour with gusts strong enough to shake the cabin walls. Outside temperatures dropped to 5 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, while wind chill effects made the effective temperature far lower. Johann monitored interior conditions throughout the 3-day blow, comparing his results with reports from neighboring homesteaders. The sod-skirted cabin maintained remarkably stable interior temperatures despite the severe conditions. Floor temperatures near the outer walls stayed in the upper 30s to low 40s in degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for comfortable walking in wool socks. The central area above the cellar held steady in the mid-40s, requiring only moderate stoking to maintain livable conditions. Most significantly, the overnight temperature drop when the fire burned down to coals was limited to just 3 or 4 degrees, compared to the 10 to 15 degree swings Johann had experienced during his first winter. Fuel consumption data confirmed the envelope improvement's effectiveness. Johann burned approximately 3¼ cords of wood through his second winter, a reduction of nearly 1/4 compared to his previous year's consumption of 4 cords. The combination of reduced heat loss through the sod-protected walls and the draft-sealing double floor meant that more of each log's heat energy stayed inside the living space, instead of escaping to the prairie wind. Neighboring families reported dramatically different results during the same storm period. The Anderson cabin, built on conventional piers with a single plank floor, required nearly constant stoking to prevent interior temperatures from dropping below freezing. Their children slept in coats and boots, huddled on pallets raised well above the floor level. The Hendersons, who had rebuilt their claim shanty with thicker walls but retained the standard raised foundation, burned through a full cord of wood in just the 3 days of severe weather. The success of Johann's envelope improvements attracted attention from practical-minded neighbors who were struggling with high fuel costs and uncomfortable living conditions. Lars Olsen began planning a sod skirt for his own cabin, asking detailed questions about drainage, construction sequence, and maintenance requirements. Even Elias Turner, the skeptical carpenter who had predicted failure for Johann's under-cabin cellar, admitted privately that the earth-coupled system was outperforming conventional construction in measurable ways. The sod skirt and double floor had solved the immediate problems of drafts and uneven heating while working synergistically with the deep cellar foundation. The cabin now functioned as an integrated thermal system where earth mass, envelope protection, and controlled air exchange combined to create stable, comfortable conditions with minimal fuel input. However, new challenges around moisture management and air quality were beginning to emerge as the tightly sealed cabin accumulated humidity and cooking odors that would require Johann's attention in the seasons ahead. By Johann's third winter, the tightly sealed cabin cellar system had created new problems that threatened both food storage and family health. Condensation began beating on the underside of the floor joists during mild spells, as warm, moist air from cooking and breathing met the cooler surfaces above the cellar. The stored vegetables showed troubling signs of premature sprouting and surface mold, indicating that temperatures had crept too high and humidity was accumulating without adequate air circulation. On still days when the wind dropped, the family complained of heavy, stale air that felt oppressive despite the moderate temperatures. The root cellar, sealed too effectively by Johann's improvements, had become a victim of its own success. Potatoes that should have remained dormant through winter began developing green shoots by February. Several heads of cabbage showed fuzzy gray mold along their outer leaves, requiring careful trimming to salvage the sound hearts underneath. Most concerning, Johann noticed that the cellar air had developed a musty odor that suggested moisture was accumulating faster than it could escape through the tightly fitted stairwell door. Johann's education in controlled ventilation began during a trading expedition to Fort Randall, where he observed the post's partially earth-sheltered commissary building. The structure, used to store flour, hardtack, and other supplies through harsh seasons, featured a simple but effective ventilation system that kept goods dry and fresh. The post quartermaster explained that the building used two wooden shafts, one drawing air in near the floor level and another exhausting stale air from near the ceiling, creating a gentle circulation that prevented both freezing and spoilage. More detailed guidance came from an unexpected source when Johann encountered a Lakota carpenter named Joseph Horn, who was working on repairs to buildings at the Indian Agency. Horn had grown up in traditional earth lodges along the Missouri River and possessed intimate knowledge of how these structures managed air quality through long winters. He explained that successful earth houses always used paired openings at different heights, with the main fire positioned between the low air inlet and the high smoke hole to create steady circulation that kept both air and people healthy. Horn's technical knowledge proved remarkably sophisticated. He described how earth lodge builders carefully sized their ventilation openings based on the lodge diameter and occupancy, using rules of thumb developed over generations of cold weather living. The low inlet, typically facing away from prevailing winds, brought fresh air that was tempered by contact with earth walls before reaching the living area. The high exhaust, warmed by rising smoke and heated air, created natural draft that pulled stale air and excess moisture out of the structure continuously. Johann also gained insights from a military circular on barracks ventilation that reached the county land office in 1876. The document, prepared by Army medical officers dealing with respiratory illness in crowded wooden buildings, emphasized the same high-low principle that Horn had described. Fresh air should enter low, and stale air should exit high, with the heating source positioned to drive circulation rather than fight it. The circular included rough calculations for vent sizing based on room volume and occupancy, providing Johann with quantitative guidance for his own system. Implementation of controlled ventilation required careful planning and precise construction. Johann added 2 wooden duct systems to his cellar during the summer of 1876, when dry conditions allowed him to work in the excavation without fighting mud and seepage. The intake shaft entered the cellar near the north wall, close to floor level where incoming air would be cooled by contact with the stone walls and earth floor. The shaft extended vertically through the cabin floor and sod skirt, terminating just above ground level, with a simple wooden hood that kept rain and snow out while allowing air entry. The exhaust shaft proved more complex to install. Johann positioned it near the cellar's south wall, drawing air from the warmest area near the ceiling where heat accumulated from the cabin above. The exhaust duct ran vertically through the cabin structure, passing close to the stovepipe to gain additional warmth that would strengthen the draft. Above the roofline, the exhaust stack rose an additional 3 feet, topped with a simple cap that prevented downdrafts while allowing free airflow. Both ducts were constructed from split oak planks, carefully fitted and sealed with pine pitch to prevent air leakage. The internal dimensions measured roughly 6 inches by 8 inches, sized according to Army guidelines to provide adequate airflow without creating uncomfortable drafts. Johann fitted removable wooden dampers in both shafts, allowing him to adjust airflow rates based on weather conditions and seasonal storage requirements. The controlled ventilation system transformed the cellar's performance during its first full year of operation. Summer storage trials showed dramatically improved results, with root vegetables maintaining firm texture and natural color through the hottest months. Johann monitored cellar conditions using simple but effective methods, noting that temperatures held steady in the upper 30s to low 40s in degrees Fahrenheit even during July heat waves, while humidity remained low enough to prevent condensation on stored goods. The ventilation improvements also enhanced the cabin's air quality and thermal performance. The steady circulation eliminated the stuffy conditions that had plagued still winter days, while the tempered incoming air reduced cold drafts that might otherwise make the living space uncomfortable. Johann observed that the cabin's overall temperature became more uniform, with less stratification between floor and ceiling levels. Food preservation results provided quantitative evidence of the system's effectiveness. During the summer of 1877, when a wet spring was followed by an exceptionally hot, dry period, Johann's controlled cellar maintained ideal storage conditions while neighboring families struggled with spoilage. His potato storage showed less than 5% loss to sprouting or rot, compared to losses of 25 to 30%, reported by families using simpler, unvented pits. The ventilation system required seasonal adjustments that Johann learned through experience and observation. During winter months, he partially closed the dampers to reduce airflow and conserve heat, while maintaining enough circulation to prevent moisture buildup. Summer operation called for maximum ventilation during cool nighttime hours, with reduced airflow during hot daytime periods to maintain low cellar temperatures. Johann's innovation attracted interest from neighboring families who had observed his consistently successful food storage and comfortable living conditions. Eric Haugen began planning a similar ventilation system for his own root cellar, asking detailed questions about duct sizing, damper construction, and seasonal operation procedures. Even skeptical neighbors acknowledged that Johann's earth-coupled cabin was outperforming conventional structures in multiple measurable ways, from fuel consumption to food preservation to overall comfort and air quality. The controlled ventilation system completed Johann's cabin-cellar integration, creating a structure that effectively managed temperature, humidity, and air quality through all seasons while maintaining the thermal benefits of earth coupling and envelope protection. The morning of January 12, 1888, dawned deceptively mild across Dakota Territory, with temperatures hovering near freezing and light winds that suggested nothing more threatening than typical winter weather. Children walked to school in light coats, and farmers ventured out for routine chores without heavy winter gear. By mid-afternoon, a wall of black clouds advanced from the northwest with terrifying speed, dropping temperatures 40 degrees in less than 3 hours while unleashing winds that would be remembered as the most destructive prairie storm in frontier memory. The school children's blizzard, as newspapers would later name it, struck with unprecedented suddenness and ferocity. Temperatures plunged from 28 degrees Fahrenheit at noon to 18 degrees below zero by evening, while sustained winds of 50 miles per hour drove snow so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. The storm's timing caught entire communities unprepared, trapping families in houses that had seemed adequate during normal winter conditions, but proved dangerously inadequate against the Arctic onslaught. Johann's integrated cabin-cellar system faced its ultimate test as the storm raged for 36 consecutive hours. The deep earth coupling that had provided steady comfort through previous winters now became a matter of survival as surface conditions turned lethal. Johann monitored his system's performance using thermometers positioned throughout the cabin and cellar, creating a detailed record of how Earth-integrated construction responded to extreme atmospheric assault. The cellar temperature held remarkably stable throughout the crisis, varying only between 38 and 42 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the savage conditions above ground. The 10-foot depth and surrounding stone walls buffered the space from the temperature extremes, maintaining the steady thermal reservoir that Johann had built his system around. The controlled ventilation system, with dampers partially closed for winter operation, continued providing fresh air without allowing the cellar to lose its thermal stability to the frigid winds above. Inside the main cabin, floor temperatures above the cellar remained in the upper 30s to low 40s throughout the storm, warm enough that the family could move about comfortably in wool stockings, even when the iron stove burned down to coals. The double floor system, with its insulating sand layer, prevented drafts while maintaining thermal connection to the stable cellar conditions below. The sod skirt around the cabin's perimeter, now buried under massive snowdrifts, provided additional insulation that kept the foundation zone from losing heat to the wind-scoured surface. Johann's fuel consumption during the crisis totaled approximately 1/2 cord of mixed wood over the 36-hour period, maintaining interior temperatures sufficient for comfortable survival. The thermal mass of the earth-coupled system absorbed heat when the stove ran hot and released it gradually when the fire burned lower, moderating the temperature swings that might otherwise have made the cabin uninhabitable during such extreme conditions. Neighboring homesteads suffered dramatically different fates during the same storm. The Larson cabin, built on conventional stone piers with a single plank floor over open crawl space, became nearly uninhabitable as snow packed under the structure, and interior temperatures dropped toward freezing despite continuous stoking. The family huddled in blankets around their red-hot stove, burning through more than a full cord of precious firewood while still enduring conditions that threatened frostbite. The Peterson house, constructed with thicker walls but retaining the standard raised foundation and separate surface cellar, fared only marginally better. Their main room stayed above freezing, but floor temperatures dropped into the teens, forcing the family to pile straw and quilts on tables and chairs to escape the cold radiating up from below. Their surface root cellar froze solid, destroying most of their stored vegetables and threatening their food security through the remaining winter months. Structural performance provided another measure of system superiority during the blizzard's aftermath. Houses built on shallow foundations showed new settling and cracking as frost penetrated deeper than usual, heaving piers and skewing door frames. The Hendricks place, rebuilt after their earlier failure, developed a pronounced lean as frost action lifted one corner of their pier foundation, while the opposite corner settled into softened soil. Johann's continuous stone foundation, anchored below the frost line and distributing loads evenly around the cellar perimeter, showed no signs of movement or damage. The deep excavation had placed the bearing surfaces in stable soil, unaffected by surface freeze-thaw cycles, while the integrated foundation design eliminated the stress concentrations that caused isolated pier systems to fail under extreme conditions. The storm's impact on different ventilation approaches revealed crucial differences in system robustness. Cabins relying on random air leakage through loose construction suffered severe drafts as wind pressure forced frigid air through every gap and crack, making interior spaces difficult to heat and uncomfortable to occupy. Houses sealed too tightly without controlled ventilation developed dangerous condensation and air quality problems, as humidity from breathing and cooking accumulated with no escape path. Johann's paired intake and exhaust shafts with adjustable dampers set for winter operation maintained adequate air quality while preventing the system from losing thermal stability. The intake air, tempered by contact with earth walls before entering the living space, avoided the shock of direct exposure to the sub-zero surface conditions. The exhaust stack, warmed by its proximity to the stovepipe, maintained sufficient draft to remove stale air and excess moisture without creating uncomfortable downdrafts. Food storage performance during the extended crisis demonstrated the integrated system's reliability under stress. While surface cellars across the township froze solid and destroyed entire winter food supplies, Johann's deep cellar maintained temperatures that kept stored vegetables in excellent condition. Potatoes remained firm and showed no frost damage, while root vegetables retained their nutritional value and storage quality throughout the emergency period. Recovery from the blizzard revealed the broader implications of building system choices. Families whose houses had failed to provide adequate shelter faced weeks of repair work, replacement of frozen food stores, and in some cases, complete reconstruction of damaged foundations. Several homesteaders abandoned their claims entirely, defeated by the combination of structural failure and food loss that followed the storm. Johann's cabin required no repairs and suffered no food losses, allowing the family to continue normal winter routines while neighbors struggled with crisis recovery. The integrated earth-coupled system had proven its resilience under the most extreme conditions the prairie climate could deliver, validating the traditional and indigenous building principles that Johann had adapted to frontier circumstances. The storm's aftermath marked a turning point in local building practices as practical homesteaders began adopting elements of Johann's approach. Eric Haugen, started planning a deep undercabin cellar for his next building project. While even skeptical carpenters acknowledged that earth coupling offered advantages that conventional raised construction could not match in harsh climate conditions.